Hello everyone and welcome back to Silla's Podcats, or welcome to Silla's Podcats, the YouTube show where I talk about books because I cannot keep my thoughts to myself. I am still somewhat sick. I've been carrying this goddamn thing with me the entire time. It's not the C word, so that's great. It's just a cold. I hate it. But anyway, so I've decided that I really want to film this video because it's been a while since I read the book and I really want to get my thoughts out there. And we're just gonna go for it. Excuse me if I cut up this video a bit more than usual because I managed to have a coughing fit in between sentences. I'm also... I have a cough drop in my mouth right now, so don't worry about that, just ignore it. And let's just get back to what you're all here for. Because as the title might suggest, I'm going to be talking about Dune today, and it's not going to be good. Alright, so, first of all, this is the 50th anniversary edition, which came out a while ago because Dune is actually pretty fucking old. That's not necessarily a problem. I've read a bunch of classics, and I've also decided to kind of like name this as a classic, in this case for science fiction, and or fantasy specifically, because it's kind of like, it's one of those books that can apply to both genres, and that both genres have definitely taken advantage and advantage of and inspiration from. So I've decided that Dune kind of like counts as one of the classics there, which was one of the reasons that I've been meaning to read it for a while now. Another reason is that a lot of people, especially with the resurgence of like the Dune hype, I would say, specifically with the movie that came out in what, 2021? Something along those lines. Or like the new movie, I should say, because there is an older version and it looks interesting. I quite like it, actually. It's just still interesting. So there was a new resurgence of people talking about Dune and specifically criticizing Dune, especially for its Orientalist content. And I wanted to check the book out myself. I wanted to see what people were on about, because for every single person making a very thorough review of Dune, sometimes specifically the movie, sometimes specifically the book, and sometimes both, talking about how Orientalist it was and how much Frank Herbert just took advantage of a culture that he probably shouldn't have taken advantage of whatsoever and then tried to depict in his book. All the way to criticizing the movie for not having Arab actors play any of the Fremen, all of that good stuff. And for every single article like that, there was a slew of comments, mostly from science fiction and fantasy fans, specifically Dune fans, talking about how, no, Dune is not like that. Dune is criticizing all these tropes that people are naming. Dune is supposed to be a criticism of the white savior trope, which is also something that a lot of people have remarked upon. Dune is supposed to be a criticism of the exploitation of the East. All of that good stuff. And since I had already kind of been meaning to read Dune, because I do like to sometimes find out where some of the origins of popular tropes within sci-fi fantasy, two of the genres I read mostly, come from, that kind of made me even more interested in picking it up because I wanted to see what it was about. And I wanted to see if the people claiming all of these things, like for example, you know, Dune is actually supposed to be a criticism of the white savior trope, I wanted to see where these people got that idea from. Not necessarily because I believe them, but just because I wanted to see where exactly they were basing their argument on. Having read these, how many? Hang on, let me just skip the appendices? Is that how you say it? I think that's how you say it. Okay, so having read 530 pages approximately of Dune, the first book in that series with the same title, by Frank Herbert, yeah, I'm sorry, I will have to agree with basically every single bit of criticism that has been said about Dune regarding Orientalism and the white savior trope. And we're gonna dissect all of that. Let's go. So first and foremost, for anyone who really has no idea what Dune is about, who's never had any contact with it, to very quickly summarize the first book, we have the planet Arrakis. The planet Arrakis has been deemed unhospitable and almost entirely uninhabitable, even though it is inhabited by several desert tribes. More on that later. However, it is also a planet that is the epicenter of a war going on, which is also called the Spice War, because Arrakis is the only planet in the entire system that we know of. We don't really know a lot about the system, to be quite honest. The first book focuses almost entirely on Arrakis. That's not what I have an issue with. It's everything else, basically. Arrakis is the only planet that produces something they just call spice, capital S, which is something that they use to make their spaceships go. If anyone has any idea whatsoever about US politics in the East, in the Middle East specifically, you know what Frank Herbert was taking his inspiration from. It's not hard. Try pronouncing Arrakis slightly differently. There you go. Right, so, in the middle of that intergalactic conflict, if that's what we want to call it, enter our protagonist, Paul. He is the son and heir of the Atreides family, who finally, after years of Harkonnen, which is a different family essentially, after years, if not decades, of Harkonnen rule on Arrakis, is finally given the privilege of owning Arrakis and being the ones to harvest the spice, something the Harkonnens don't really take lightly to. Slight spoiler alert, and we're going to get into a bit more spoilers later on as well. The Harkonnens retaliate by trying to essentially eradicate the entire Atreides family. However, they fail spectacularly so, because the one person that they probably should have killed all along, because of course he's the protagonist and he's the most important one, is Paul. Paul and his mother Jessica get away from the massacre that is committed against the Atreides family, and we essentially go from there. Right. That's Dune summed up really, really quickly. Also, there's worms. Sandworms. They're massive. More on that later. So the basic premise of the book is not necessarily that complicated, and I will say that for the size of it, the small font of it, and the amount of people that have talked about Dune being rather inaccessible, I found the writing and reading process itself to be alright. There were moments and aspects, especially where Frank Herbert goes a bit more into the political aspect of things, that I found somewhat confusing. Mostly because he either bothered to explain none of it, or he explained the same thing approximately 15 times and then left me in the dark about everything else once more. And I was like, please, sir, I am begging you. My brain is big enough to understand sci-fi fantasy politics, but at some point, I need something, anything, any kind of information would be great. Thank you in advance. So that wasn't necessarily a problem for me. Some of the word choices that he made were certainly that. They were choices. I am a very big fan of like fantasy prose. I'm a really big fan of prose that almost lends itself to purple prose. Love that kind of stuff. Frank Herbert felt like he was sometimes trying to be willfully obtuse, and I wasn't exactly the biggest fan of that, because I was just over there like, dude, I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. Why are you telling me that there's forgotting in the sky? Why are we calling the sky a slur now? I've googled it after that, because English is not my first language, believe it or not. I've googled it, and apparently the word was also very obscurely referencing stitching and or scaffolding, which still makes no sense to me, but here we are. Right, so some of the word choices were very odd, some of the descriptions were very odd. The man was very clearly trying to get across that he knew how a thesaurus worked, and you know, that's great. Good for him, I suppose. Good for him. So the writing itself, fine. The world building itself, fine, if very simplified every once in a while. However, again, I am perfectly fine in saying this. The first book is set almost entirely on Arrakis, and I'm fine with that. The first book is trying to establish Arrakis as a planet, it is trying to establish the Fremen, it is trying to establish the Atreides family, the Harkonnens, and the fact that, yes, there is an empire technically, like in the background, but the only importance the empire is awarded is essentially this like driving force behind everything technically, and it's kind of like the cesspool of political intrigue that's going on. That's really it. So most of the action, if not almost all of the action, is focused on Arrakis and Arrakis specifically, which I didn't have an issue with. The book, again, alluded to larger things looming on the horizon, but it was mostly like, okay, so now we're on Arrakis, and now we're gonna talk about Arrakis. That's fine. A lot of books, specifically in sci-fi fantasy, do that, where they kind of like establish the world as a bit bigger in the background, but like, hey, we're going to focus on this one spot right here. I had no issues with that, so that was also fine. I've quickly run out of good things to say. Right, so let's see what to get into first. Right, so the I can't talk anymore. The Orientalist thing. Yeah, it's all over the place. It is all over the place. So again, a few things that we have. Arrakis is a desert planet. That's great. It is deemed uninhabitable by what we could summarize is the equivalent of Western society in this universe. There's people living on it. There is people living on the desert planet that other people have deemed uninhabitable and thus ready for exploitation. Already not a great look. The Fremen are consistently dismissed. The Fremen are also consistently painted with a very barbaric slash almost, I don't even want to say it, terrorist brush stroke. They're these wild men and, you know, sometimes also women. Everyone obviously learns how to fight really well, even as a child. They're vicious, they want to attack everyone. We're not going to talk about the fact that they have consistently been exploited for the past decades. So honestly, if they're quick to swing a knife, I don't blame them. I don't blame a single one of them. However, there were also a lot of inconsistencies which are very prevalent with the whole Orientalist thing, as in they are both painted as savages but also as helpless savages in a way, if that makes sense. As an example, at first they are presented to be able to basically defeat the Sardaukar. No idea if I'm pronouncing this correctly, to be quite honest, which are basically elitist fighter troops of the Empire. They are, the Fremen are presented to be able to kill these Sardaukar very easily. They don't really even consider it a challenge to defeat them, more like a nuisance. This is very explicit in the book. When one of the Atreides contenders essentially meets the Fremen, and the Fremen are basically just like, oh my god, another one of these goddamn Sardaukar, alright, we're just gonna kill them and be done with it. So on one hand, they are presented as these wild and very angry fighters and savages that just ravage through the country and just tear up everyone who's not a Fremen and whom they don't like, which is, you know, understandable, but hey. On the other hand, they are presented as almost entirely helpless when it comes to bettering their own social, well, their own living ways, essentially, and their own fighting, which makes no sense whatsoever because you've just established that the Fremen are really, really dangerous and fight very well. But there is quite literally a scene where, after the whole debacle happens with Paul and he is, you know, declared dead even though he's currently with the Fremen, more on that later, there is a moment where one of the former members of the Atreides household is basically saying like, well, the Fremen have improved so much in their fighting over the past years. They're using strategies that I myself would have used. Only for the book to then basically go like, yeah, that's because Paul is finally leading them, so now they actually know how to fight with strategies. I feel like I shouldn't have to point out how bad that is. And on the other hand, as I've said, the Western societies, which again I'm using quotation marks because there's not really a Western and Eastern society specifically within the book's universe. It's just very obvious where these people are taking their inspiration from, where Frank Herbert took his inspiration from in order to make these people the way that they are. So the Western societies in Dune, in that empire, have deemed Arrakis uninhabitable, or at the very least extremely hostile, which, fair enough, I suppose. However, the Fremen, first of all, are living on the planet, not necessarily just fine, like they do have like water shortages and everything, so like it's not a happy paradise, but they are living on it, so it's not uninhabitable by definition alone. But also, at some point, Paul finds out that the Fremen have not only started to organize in different ways, but they have also started to have these massive water reservoirs underneath the surface of the planet that no one else knows about but the Fremen. And this water is not supposed to be touched by anyone, so they've just been collecting it for years at this point. Because they've started the very ambitious dream of turning Arrakis into an actual paradise, as in trying to make sure that not the entire planet is covered by the desert that they are currently living in, but rather that the planet has a lot of green and habitable spaces for humans to exist peacefully, without having to go through the somewhat extreme measures of surviving in the desert, like for example with a still suit which collects every milliliter of water that you could possibly sweat or piss out, essentially, filters it, and then lets you drink from it. Sounds great, you say. Sounds like they are innovative and like they're trying to make a change and like they're trying to make their society and their planet sustainable for themselves. No, because the idea of this, you know, entire endeavour, this idea of the water reservoirs and the idea of changing Arrakis for the better, came from outside the planet. From an imperial planetologist, as he calls himself, basically. Because the savages could not possibly think of a way to make their own world better, right? It's small sentences sometimes, it's like really small concepts introduced and thrown at your face in between action sequences, in between characters talking to each other and actually making some sort of sense, and it threw me every single time it happened because it was so consistent. And I feel like a lot of people who just read books like Dune, for example, for entertainment, and especially white people, white Western people, don't really catch on to that explicitly. And I'm pretty sure that I've missed stuff as well because I haven't studied, like I haven't yet read Orientalism by Said, for example, in its entirety, which is what brought the whole thing of like Orientalist literature, etc., etc., to the forefront of people's minds. Well, at least white Western people's minds, because I'm pretty sure that the people that have been Orientalized, and that these tropes apply to, have been aware for way longer. Because of course they have been. They are the ones oppressed by these narratives, they are the ones characterized and you know, falsely characterized by these stereotypes. So there it is. But Dune is rife with these little things and these inconsistencies in how people characterize the Fremen. And the thing here is, it's not just the characters doing it, right? It's not just one character who then also maybe happens to be a bad guy saying something deeply racist. It is the entire book and the entire structure and the entire thing pointing towards that. And one other big thing that usually also is like kind of related to Orientalism or crops up at almost the exact same time is the white savior trope. And boy oh boy do people have something to say about the white savior trope in Dune, and boy oh boy do I disagree with them. So again, for anyone who doesn't fully know, Dune is not just necessarily about the planet Arrakis, and it is not just necessarily about the tragedy that happens to the House Atreides, it is also about the fact that Paul is supposed to be destined to be some sort of leader of the Fremen. He is a person who is supposed to bring change by starting a war. And they don't call it a war, they call it the jihad. multiple times in this book. It cannot get any more obvious than that. So the first thing to think about this when you hear that is to go, oh yeah, so like he is a white savior at first, because he goes to the Fremen and he kind of like revolutionizes them, and he kind of like changes the way that they live, he changes the way that they think about tradition, etc, etc, and he kind of like shows them that he knows it better, right? Which is the stereotypical and standard way that a white savior trope is done. A group of native people to whichever planet, place on the earth, or whatever it is that they are coming from and that they are living in, get saved and rescued by the white savior, who obviously knows better than they do on how to defend themselves, on how to revolutionize their countryside or their planet, how to deal properly with resources, all of that good stuff, you know, all of that good stuff. That is not necessarily what Paul is. So for a brief moment, I understood why people are trying to defend this book and are trying to say, well, it's a critique of the white savior trope. Because it is, and then it isn't. So first, as I said, Paul is not necessarily a character to like revolutionize the Fremen in the sense of, he's not necessarily a white savior character to save the Fremen from a massive threat. The Fremen are under threat, yes. Arrakis is consistently colonized, and it is consistently exploited by colonizers. First the nasty colonizers, the Harkonnens, and then the nice colonizers, the Atreides, who are such good people because they see the Fremen as people and they also want to not destroy Arrakis. The bar is in hell. So Paul is not necessarily saving the Fremen from that kind of threat. In fact, one could argue that Paul is bringing the threat to the Fremen, because he is bringing the danger of radicalizing them to the Fremen. Like, the entire thing that happens is that Paul, for example, starts having nightmares about how he is leading the war. I'm not gonna call it that word again. He is leading a war against the entire universe, well, you know, so like the Empire, with help of the Fremen, and he is the reason they become radicalized. So at first glance you might go, yeah, well, like, so he's not saving them, right? It seems like he's more like corrupting them. So you would think that maybe you could just say, well, so he's not a white savior, right? And that is where you would be wrong. Because if we consider that Paul is not a savior character, then he is still characterized as the character who is more or less single-handedly able to turn the Fremen into a war machine. The Fremen are not giving any kind of agency in this. In fact, every single time the Fremen tried, or like some of the Fremen characters try to take back that agency for themselves, they get denied that agency over and over and over again. At some point, Paul even uses the voice, capital V, which is a sort of manipulation tactic that the Bene Gesserit, of which I will be talking in just a second, he uses the voice, a manipulation tactic by the Bene Gesserit, that he has been trained in by his mother Jessica. He uses the voice to tell the Fremen that maybe they should start to reconsider their traditions and that some of their traditions are shit. Which is a very nice thing to say from an outsider, but it grows even more horrifying when you realize that they quite literally do not have a choice in the matter, because if you use the voice on someone, you can make them do whatever you want. And while he is not using the voice to tell them, hey, denounce your practices, he is using the voice to tell them, hey, shut up and listen to me because I have something important to say. Without giving them a legitimate chance to defend themselves or their practices whatsoever. On the other hand, Jessica, who is a Bene Gesserit, which is basically a bunch of women who supposedly manipulate everything from the sidelines. More on that later, as I said. She gets chosen as the Fremen's shaman figure, relatively towards the beginning of Jessica and Paul being found by the Fremen and then subsequently taken in by the clan. She is quite literally an outsider figure who replaces a deeply religious figure of the Fremen. And then basically also gets to tell them what to do. Are we seeing the problem here? Are we seeing the trend? Because here's the thing, right? If we say that Paul is not a white savior because he's not saving the Fremen from anything, if anything he's tempting them into destruction, we immediately argue that the Fremen are quote-unquote naive enough to be led into destruction without doing anything about it. And if you read the book more closely, you realize that every single time they try to do something about it, they get stopped by something or someone. And more often than not, it is Paul or Jessica themselves. Two outsiders from a noble family that was colonizing Arrakis get to tell the Fremen, the native population of Arrakis that has been living there for centuries, they get to tell them what to do. They get to interpret their traditions for them. Yes, they also partake in that traditions to a certain degree, but they get to transform them. And no matter how much Paul is trying not to lead the Fremen into a genocidal war, no matter, absolutely no matter how much he's trying to resist that, that doesn't make him into a heroic figure. And I fully understand that he's not necessarily supposed to be, and people have told me that the, like, criticism of the white savior trope gets addressed in later books, but I'm telling you right now, I shouldn't have to read 3+ books for a trope to finally be criticized, especially not when every single thing I've heard Dune fanboys and fangirls, but mostly fanboys to be quite honest, say about this book is an immediate rebuttal of any and all claims that this could be a white savior trope. It's not obvious in the movie, it is not obvious in the book, and the book even quite literally contradicts you, at least in book 1. Because again, even if we say that Paul is doing anything in his power to not lead the Fremen on a destructive war against the entire empire, against the entire universe that we know of, he is in the power to do so, because the Fremen do not have agency whatsoever. And that is questionable, to say the least. Very questionable. We also have, this was quite funny to me actually, we do have a love story in this as well, between Paul and Chani, one of the Fremen that Paul meets relatively early on. Frank Herbert apparently realized that he cannot write romance for shit, and so he basically time skips in between Chani and Paul being like, yeah, maybe we're in love, all the way to, by the way, they have a son now. I found that very funny because at least Frank Herbert realized that he could not write romance for the life of him and was like, skip, they're a family now and they have a son. And you know what? I support him realizing where he would have fucked up. Should have taken a leaf out of that one, Robert Jordan, because you felt free to be inspired by basically everything in this book. Moving on. However, the issue with Chani is not just, it's not necessarily, not just, but just, it's not necessarily that Frank Herbert didn't really do anything with the romance, because once more, I actually kind of like it that he was like, I can't do this, so I'm just not gonna bother. Good thinking on that, sir. The issue with Chani is that the way that she's presented by the narrating characters, most specifically Jessica, because Chani is, if I remember correctly, as old as Paul is in the book, which is 15. So round about that age, I would say. Jessica switches very frequently between essentially calling her a girl, which is fine, and calling her the equivalent of a Orientalist temptress who is tempting her son into actually agreeing to marry her. Yikes, that's a very big Orientalist trope, you know, so check mark, I suppose. She also keeps going on about the fact that if Paul is trying to have any kind of like standing foothold in the Empire, he should just make Chani his concubine and not his wife. That's a whole other thing we could unpack. We'll just leave that there in the corner, I suppose. Chani also gets, like, Chani is probably one of the Fremen characters that is the most developed. which is very telling because she also doesn't have that many scenes where she appears, or where she gets to make any kind of decision on her own without Paul and or Jessica weighing in. Cool. That's a whole other thing. So that thing is also very weird. There's also this one bit that I remarked upon to Steph, because I was updating Steph on every single one of my thoughts, and she loved it. So there's that. Thank you, Steph, for listening to me, by the way. There's one bit where Paul refuses to call Chani his wife, but he calls her the mother of my son. My son, not our son. I wasn't a fan of that. And if you consider that Chani and Jessica are basically the two only women that have any kind of, like, major appearance in the book. Yeah, questions. So many questions. I don't want any of them answered, actually. I'm good. Right. We're gonna get to one of the parts that also very much bothered me. The Bene Gesserit. So as I said, for anyone again who doesn't know, the Bene Gesserit are a group of women who possess almost supernatural powers. It's not really defined what exactly they can do. From what I understood it as, it sounded a lot like manipulation of, like, your voice, like voice modulation, to make people more agreeable to what it is you're saying, essentially. It's never fully explained if what they do is, like, legitimate magic, or if it's just, you know, voice training, essentially. You could say maybe like a mixture of both. I don't mind that it wasn't explained. I'm actually a very big fan of magic being as vague as possible, so you can always go, did that really happen, or did it just sound fancy for the author? We don't know. We will never know. It's fine. Moving on. However, several issues arise if you look at the Bene Gesserit just a tiny bit closer. So issue number 1 is very closely related to what I talked about with the white savior trope, and how Paul, despite maybe not being necessarily a savior, still falling into some categories of that trope, including but not limited the manipulation of an entire populace that doesn't know any better because they are naive savages. And that is the fact that if you read the book a bit more closely and if you pay a bit more attention to it, there is a very big chance that you might go, well, hang on a second, how do people know that Paul is supposedly this messiah figure that everyone is waiting for? It's because the Bene Gesserit appear to have been manipulating their way into historical records and so on and so forth, and haven't necessarily written prophecies of Paul appearing, but have manipulated religious texts the way that they wanted to in order for this entire business to start. Obviously, what that does to a certain extent is alleviate Paul's guilt as an individual. Because, again, if the reason people believe him to be this savior, this messiah, is because others have manipulated them into doing so and Paul had nothing to do with it, he is essentially just as much a figurehead as the people actively being manipulated into committing war crimes. However, several issues arise with that as well. Sure, Paul now as an individual is no longer necessarily at fault for what is happening, specifically with the Fremen. However, his mother very much is, and the entire, you know, order of the Bene Gesserit is. And another reason why that might sound very problematic is they are in the background manipulating everything, but practically, the Bene Gesserit don't really have a lot of power. The way that Frank Herbert wrote them is to be excellent manipulators from the shadows, and nothing else. The Bene Gesserit are essentially treated as breeding mares. They are married into families to produce heirs, which are always exclusively daughters. We don't know if they do that on purpose, as in if they kill male fetuses, if they kill male children. We don't know. It's not necessarily told to us. It is, however, somewhat implied that something like this might be taking place, especially because Jessica is said to have resisted the command of only bearing daughters when she had Paul. Fun fact. And not only are the Bene Gesserit essentially treated as broodmares, but they are also not given any information about their family lines whatsoever. And this is, and I quote, or more or less quote from memory, because they might be required to marry into their direct family in order to have children. And they're not supposed to know that. Isn't that fun? And yes, sure, the Bene Gesserit have a character named, or like, a leader named Mother Superior, so technically you could argue that the Bene Gesserit are in control of themselves. The Bene Gesserit are a women-led group of people, or a women-led group of women, controlled by women, controlling women. However, it seems very much set in, like, it seems very much like a female group set into a very patriarchal society. So essentially, what we have nowadays, so that's great. This again also shows itself with the fact that every single Bene Gesserit is isolated from any kind of family claims she could possibly have, whereas men always seem to take pride in, like, tracing back their legacies. Cool. Most Bene Gesserit also don't marry into families, they become concubines, which once more kind of like establishes a different kind of societal structure and hierarchy and power that they have. So the Bene Gesserit are very much established as this like group in the background that nonetheless manipulate everything that's happening. So they're technically claim to have a lot of political power, we just never really see that. Like, it is very much not active power, but it sometimes also doesn't seem to be passive power as well. Obviously men still hate the Bene Gesserit because they have power, and so they're witches, and also evil. And, that's also very great. It's a very fantastic treatment of women. So, you know, fun. Again, I think the thing that I took the biggest issue with was really just the whole, like, you know, they've been manipulating prophecies and so on and so forth from the start, so Paul is essentially just as much a puppet of their machinations as the Fremen are of Paul's machinations and, you know, the Bene Gesserit machinations combined, because it alleviates so much individual guilt. Which on one hand is interesting to explore. I'm actually kind of intrigued if later Dune books like go even further into that. But I don't necessarily like the implications of that, particularly because, as I said, the only two female characters that have a bit more of a standing are someone from the Bene Gesserit, who then gets to become a religious figure of the Fremen and basically just, like, you know, manipulate them further into genocide, and Chani, who is more or less painted by the only female character who gets to directly interact with her as an Oriental whore. It's a great track record, Frank Herbert. It's fantastic. I really love it. So, I was not a fan. Very briefly, because, you know, with everything else that's going on in Dune, this is actually not even that relevant, but the Baron of the Harkonnens, who's essentially painted as one of the big, like, individual antagonists of this book specifically, because he's the one to tell, you know, his troops that, hey, don't you want to, like, go ape shit and kill all of the Atreides family? And then you can't even do that, right? He is a fat, disabled, gay pedophile. I'm just gonna let that stand in the room right there. Again, great track record. And yes, you could argue that he's more a pedophile than he's a gay man, but, like, he's explicitly said to take boys. Explicitly some that look like Paul. And he, at some point, is referenced to not want one of them to be as sedated, because he wants him to put up a fight. If you are thoroughly disgusted, so was I. And, like, I mean, I suppose it's a great thing to show a pedophile as an actual villain, but when you put everything together like that, it just doesn't look very good. And it's just, like, the descriptions of how fat he is and how disgusting that makes him are almost worse than descriptions of him legitimately committing mass murder, and, like, that's a problem. Right, like, I hope we all see that that is a problem. Please tell me you do. So, yes, as a whole, there's just not a lot to defend Dune with. I'm sorry. Like, even if the whole white savior thing, even if the whole, well, Paul is actually not the messiah of the Fremen, gets further addressed in later books, because as I said, even the first book is kind of clear that he's not necessarily a savior figure in the traditional sense of the word. He's not saving the Fremen from anything. In fact, he is making them commit more atrocities. Maybe not necessarily in the scale that has been done to them, because, as I said, they have been systematically oppressed and their entire planet has been colonized and has been farmed for resources to, you know, great results and everything. So, like, you know, even if Paul is not saving them from that, but is instead making them commit crimes in his name, essentially, right? Even if he's not a savior in the typical sense, he still very much falls into the category of white savior, because the Fremen have no agency in what he's doing. And it kind of gets worse if you consider that this is all basically just one big manipulation done by the Bene Gesserit. Because again, they're pretty much the only female character in this series who so far have ever gotten a voice apart from Chani. And we've talked about why the display of Chani is also problematic. So, you know, and like, even if later books keep addressing that, even if later books keep talking about this, because maybe Frank Herbert was actually considering, like, hey, maybe what I've done is kind of wrong, which I can't talk about because I've only read the first book so far. This was 530 pages. I cannot stress this enough. I shouldn't have to read more than 1,000 pages to finally get to the point where the author's like, hey, maybe I've done an oopsie and shouldn't have actually said all of that. Or shouldn't have made my characters this specific way. Or shouldn't have implied that the Fremen couldn't have possibly thought of a way to make Arrakis into a livable planet. I'm still very hung up about this. It has consistently been proven that indigenous populations know way better to take care of the earth that they live on than anyone else. Why? So, yes. Was it enjoyable on just a reading level? Kind of. Was it enjoyable considering everything else? Not really. Am I considering continuing on with this series? Maybe. I might try it. Overall, do I regret my experience? Yes or no? Like, it was very tedious and aggravating to get through sometimes, but I was enjoying making commentary on it, and I was enjoying experiencing what people have been criticizing a lot over the years. As I said, you know, it kind of like just resurged when the movie came out, but there has been consistent criticism of this book and how it portrays everything. So it was very interesting to see that firsthand. And I will also say that it was very interesting reading this book and considering how much it has done for the sci-fi fantasy genre, as in how much other authors have been inspired by this. I've mentioned Robert Jordan, who wrote the Wheel of Time series until he unfortunately passed away before he could finish it. And going into this, I knew that like his Aiel culture was very much inspired by the Fremen. I had not realized just how much, though. I legitimately had no idea. That was, not sure if you can still just call that inspiration and be done with it. There's a lot of parallels, not just with the Aiel culture and the Fremen, but also with the Bene Gesserit and the Aes Sedai, for example. You know, a group of women in a society that tries to make you believe that women have a lot of political power, and then you look closer at them, and you're like, whoops, no they don't, and they're still antagonized by the entire male culture that has risen up everywhere, despite us trying to proclaim that there's a lot of matriarchies going on here. No, I am not whatsoever salty about that. What do you mean? So yeah, there is legitimately a lot that Dune has quote-unquote done for the sci-fi fantasy community and the sci-fi fantasy readership and authorship, because a lot of people have been inspired by this. Star Wars, for example, is another big example of George Lucas looking at Dune and being like, hey, I could do something with that. So it is, to a certain extent, definitely a staple of the community and a classic of the community, and I am kind of glad I read it for that alone. I don't recommend you putting yourself through that just for that, though. Like, like, if you want to read the book like I did, if you want to find out what happens in it a bit more specifically, because you haven't done that already, if you want to see more of what I've criticized about it regarding Orientalism, especially if you know more about Orientalism than I do, which is fairly likely, feel free to read this book for that purpose. I've done so as well, which is also why I would like to say, and I forgot that at the beginning of the video, I'm a bit sorry about that, definitely did not go into this book unbiased. No one really does when reading anything, but like I had very clear expectations. Luckily the book met all of them. Unluckily so, some of them are very bad. Like, I expected it to be bad, and it was bad, so like I was correct, but at what cost, you know what I mean? So like, again, if any of what I've said struck your fancy, and if you would like to find out for yourself, if you would like to do comparisons between Dune and other well-known sci-fi fantasy books, series, movies, TV shows, and so on and so forth, feel free to do so. I encourage you to read it more as a classic than as a sci-fi story, if that makes sense, because personally I find myself to always be a bit removed from classics because I have certain expectations of them. Unfortunately, one of them is that unless the author is an author of color, it's going to be racist. It is what it is, you know. Unfortunately, but it is what it is. So again, if any of that makes you interested in picking up the book, I would say go for it. Again, it is fairly chunky. It's 530 pages in my edition, and my edition has very small font. So, you know, that's what you're going to get yourself into. Do I think that you have to read Dune if you're a sci-fi fantasy fan? Absolutely not. There's a lot of fantasy, especially from recent years, especially by diverse and marginalized authors, that you could be picking up instead of Dune. So if you're not inherently curious, if you don't want to find out more about the origins of certain sci-fi fantasy tropes, if you're not a massive fan of classic sci-fi fantasy, I don't recommend you pick up Dune. Especially not if you're marginalized. Like, even as a female reader, it's just a lot to get through, I suppose. We are spoiled right now. We have a lot more female protagonists, and they make a lot more sense than Paul. And they also don't get praised for asking basic questions. Because for some reason, everyone loves to kiss Paul's ass. Because did you know that 15-year-olds cannot ask intelligent questions to save their life, but this 15-year-old can? Anyway, that's a bit more personal territory. So, yes, as I said, to summarize, I didn't have a great time with Dune, except for the fact that I could make fun of it, which sounds a bit meaner than I wanted it to, but here we are. But I am still glad that I read it for the reasons that I've wanted to read it, and I think that it fulfilled all of the reasons as to why I wanted to pick it up. So, you know, I'm happy with that. And that's that, I suppose. This video has been going on for long enough. Right, so if you are a Dune fan, or if you've also read Dune and you disagree with some of what I said in the video, feel free to leave a comment down below. I ask you to be civil, because, like, you know, just don't attack people for views they have about books. If you can not, that would be great. Feel free to share your views down below, whether or not you agree with me, whether or not you think some points that I've made you would have loved for me to elaborate on. And let me know in the comments down below if you haven't read Dune yet, you would like to pick it up now, or if you have been forever discouraged from doing so. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on this one, because it is such a classic of the sci-fi fantasy community and the sci-fi fantasy book tradition, I suppose. So it's always really interesting to hear people's thoughts on that specifically. So again, feel free to leave them in the comments down below, and feel free to leave a like if I have now permanently discouraged you from ever picking up Dune. As always, I hope that you have a nice reading experience yourself, and that you continue having a nice reading experience, and I will see you soon.